Following program is closed captioned for the thinking impaired.
Welcome to the Lederman Studio Radio Show, presenting our world with the stories that everyone wanted, but didn't realize until they were told. Let's get started. Here's your host, Jeremie Lederman.
Welcome back, everybody. I am your host, Jeremie Lederman from Lederman Studio. I am the mastermind behind this special two-part episode. If you're wondering what makes Captain America so special that he would be dedicated to two different episodes, I think you're going to enjoy this quite a bit. Now, as I said, this is part one. In this episode, my plan is to introduce you to the creators of Captain America and give you a little bit of background on the comic book format itself. In part two, I will explain that unique history that Captain America holds and a little bit about why I believe he's become so iconic to nearly 6 generations of American culture. Now, for most of you, when you hear the name Captain America, it's just one more comic book hero in a whole ocean of other comic book heroes. However, if he was just yet another comic book hero, I wouldn't really be creating a two-part podcast to explain him, now would I? The actual history behind this character, I think, is quite amazing. The Captain America hero is one of these unique cases where art imitates life and life imitates art, and even if superheroes aren't your thing, I'll bet this story will impress even you.
Good. We now prepare our little surprise party.
Now, the Captain America character was created by two men named Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. I'm not quite going to tell you when they created him because that's kind of part of the build-up. They were two of the most highly creative men that managed to harness their hard lives into somewhat of a pure magic formula. Together, these guys became the equivalent of rock stars before there was rock. They became astronauts before there was a Sputnik. And it's a really tough time for me to try to explain to you because none of us, very few of us anyway, probably have any context to living in the 40s. But when it came to comic books, these guys were consistently delivering the goods. Now, comic books became a popular format in the mid-30s. And by the end of the Second World War, publishers were selling over 60 million of them a month. During this time, the names of Simon and Kirby pretty much became legendary. A lot of what we know about the comic book industry today is largely framed around the work these two guys did during this time period. So to kind of begin, in 1940, Joe Simon, a well-established writer and an editor, he was at a place called Fox Feature Syndicate. During that same year, in 1940, a young man named Jack Kirby kind of arrived and brought some real prodigious talent with him, some really amazing drawing skills, and one hell of a work ethic. Kirby had already had a pretty good career going by the time he met Joe Simon. The two of these guys just kicked it off and they became besties. They both had a real unique understanding of the comic book medium, and they both saw the enormous potential it had, not to mention the enormous sales that were going on, and they wanted a part of that. Over the time, the two of these guys would create the Blue Beetle, the Fly. They would begin the genre of the romance comic books. They would somewhat revive the cowboy comic book genre. They would even revive the characters of the Manhunter and the Sandman, and their foray into the horror comic books became the subject matter of one of those intense 40s investigations into how comic books were corrupting the youth.
The emotional impact of something they read in a comic book may be much the same as a real-life situation they witness. Horror and crime comics upset kids.
Now, among the millions of sales that were generated by Simon and Kirby, probably their most famous creation is Captain America. Now, before we talk too much about that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the history of the comic book format and the era that Captain America showed up in.
Part 2, the origin of the American comic book.
It started a long time ago, to be honest with you. Political cartoons kind of broke the ice, but then cartoons became a bit more elaborate. But the art form that went on to become the comic book is a unique American art form all to itself. In 1896, Richard Outcault was creating a little character called the Yellow Kid, kind of recognized as one of the first major modern comic strip characters. He first appeared in the New York Journal. So then, you know Mr. William Randolph Hearst, that notoriously nice guy. In late 1902, he took the New York Journal and released 5 different little 50-cent books with hardcover binding and reprinted all those little Sunday comic strips into a full-color format, referring to them as,
quote, the best comic books that have ever been published, end quote.
In 1932, we are introduced to the adventures of Dick Tracy. In 1934, I guess you could say the first official comic book begins. It was Famous Funnies #1. It ran for 218 issues over the next 21 years. Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, swings in around 1937, and then in 1938, Simon & Schuster bring us the big man in tights himself, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive. Mr. Superman hits the presses, millions of comics go flying off the shelf, and then the rest is history. But not to be shown up by Superman, Marvel Comics #1 appears. It says Marvel Comics, it wasn't the Marvel Comics we know. Not yet, anyway. And then on May 8th of 1940, Chicago Daily News literary editor Mr. Sterling North, he denounces the comic books in general. He says,
Quote, a poisonous mushroom growth of the last 2 years, guilty of a cultural slaughter of the innocents. End quote.
Then in 1941, yet another icon of the future is created, Dr. Martson, a Harvard psychologist and the inventor of the polygraph. He creates Wonder Woman. Later that year, 1941, yet another icon appears. Mr. Bob Kane and Mr. Bill Finger create Batman.
Do I look like a clown?
And in 1941, Simon & Kirby introduced the world to Captain America. This entire era that I've just described is called the Golden Age of Comics. That ranges from 1938 to 1950. Now, once we hit 1961, we're talking about the Silver Age of Comics. This is the era that would later on become a billion-dollar money machine for Hollywood. In 1961, DC Comics releases one of the first big superhero team comic books called the Justice League of America. It reignites the whole superhero genre.
Meanwhile, back at Marvel Comics headquarters, not to be outshadowed, they release the Fantastic Four.
Yes, the Fantastic Four hits the stands also in 1961. And what comes next is a creative explosion that has yet to be matched in the history of comic books. Between 1961 to 1964, Marvel Comics brings us the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Hulk, Thor, the Avengers, Spider-Man, Daredevil, and they resurrect Captain America. And while it might be easy to look down your nose a little bit at the entire genre of comic books, keep in mind, these books were written by extremely intelligent people, drawn by some of the world's most talented illustrators, and many kids like myself spent years reading these stories, being exposed to philosophies and ideas, words and concepts that were far more advanced than anything we were being exposed to in our normal lives. I remember being in the 5th grade and feeling compelled on my own to put together a little paper to give to my teacher. It was all about how genetics could evolve into mutations, leading to humanity evolving to new stages that would create fear and anxiety among those that were unevolved. This poor public school teacher had no concept of where I was getting this stuff from, and just assumed that I was some budding young genius and moved me to the 6th grade immediately. Anyhow, enough of the history lesson. The next part of this is going to talk about the two creators of Captain America, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby.
Part 3, The Origin of Joe Simon.
In 1905, a poor little Jewish family just arrived to America, and 8 years later, in 1913, they gave birth to a little boy named Jaime Simon, later on to be known as Joe Simon, another young poor Jewish kid from the Lower East Side of New York. At a very young age, looks like about early teens, he actually began his career in publications. He was also a very capable cartoonist, a writer, an art director, and an editor. It appears from all accounts that Joe was a good-natured man, he was very easy to get along with, and was a very consummate professional. He was like a lot of other people during that era. He wasn't a one-trick pony and did everything he could to stay expanded and very versatile. During his career, he worked at everything from newspapers to book publishers and comic book companies, obviously. Given that he managed to make a living in the arts during the Depression especially, is a testament to the kind of man that I think he was. In some of the history I've studied and the interviews about Joe Simon that I've listened to, they all comment on his high regard for punctuality, leadership, and professional attire. Here's what Jack Kirby had to say.
Joe and I met and we became partners. I respected Joe because I'd never seen a guy from upstate New York or a guy who wore such great suits.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, Joe and Jack formed a great bond together when Jack came to work at the same company. The two of them went on to create history together. And while we'll talk about Jack's genius in a minute, Joe's part of this was he was a great businessman. He was able to craft deals and put together some business plans that really benefited he and Jack. Joe had a real remarkable knack for finding trends and markets within the comic book industry, and he and Jack Kirby both benefited a great deal from this huge swell of popularity in the format. The two of them pioneered all sorts of different genres like the romance and the horror, and they also created a series of comics that were actually dedicated to veterans. In 1941, as I said, the first 10 issues of Captain America sold millions of copies each. And later, by 1942, Kirby and Simon created a comic called The Boy Commandos. Google it, it's a pretty cool concept. It was also a million-selling monthly comic. Joe was able to negotiate higher fees as well as getting their names on the covers of the books they produced. This was somewhat unheard of. Very few other artists ever got this kind of recognition. Now, in the post-war era, Joe and Jack eventually parted ways. There was nothing negative there, it was just a natural flow of business. But Joe's career then continued on much like it began. He was one of those ham and eggers that could work in just about every capacity, so he was working in a lot of different industries and did a lot of different roles throughout that time period. Joe and Jack have always stayed close, and they even occasionally worked together later on down the road in the 60s. But like I said, Joe went on to do pretty much the same things he did when his career began. In 2009, he authored a really cool hardcover book called The Best of Simon and Kirby, but it's really one of the few books that discusses their collaboration. Throughout the rest of his career, Joe maintained a great deal of respect among his peers. Long after his retirement, he still remained a hero to his contemporaries and the people that worked around him and the generations that came after the work he and Kirby did. This hero's journey came to an end in December of 2011. He died 6 months after his grandchildren walked the red carpet at the premiere of Captain America, the First Avenger.
He's really excited. Unfortunately, he can't be here, but he did go to the New York premiere.
He loved it. He said he's never seen so much action in a movie before.
You know, we grew up with Captain America on the walls of our grandfather's apartment, and now it's all over the world.
Captain America's always felt like a member of our family. It's always been a part of us, you know, how our family identifies. So to see it finally on the big screen, to see all these people who love it too, you know, it just makes it that much more special.
Joe Simon served honorably during World War II, and as a veteran, he rests in peace at Long Island National Cemetery.
Part 4. The Fantastic Story of Jack Kirby.
The amount of information there is on Jack Kirby compared to Joe Simon is almost unfair. But it is what it is, so let's run through it. Jack Kirby, otherwise known as Jacob Kurtzberg. He came into the world the same year as my dearly departed Grandpa Lederman in 1917. He was the child of poor Jewish immigrants from Austria, and they all grew up in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Jack was a self-taught artist who taught himself the comic book art form at a young age. He fell in love with comic strips early on in his life. Jack said in many of his interviews that he knew that in order to escape the poverty and the hard living of his Lower East Side neighborhood, he really had to become one of the best. Now, when it came to a work ethic, Jack Kirby was like the B.B. King of comic books. This guy had a productivity that has been legendary since his entire career was known to anyone. His attitude was to work fast and to work sincerely. He got all of this from his early childhood in the way that he had to live his life growing up. If you ever go to YouTube and listen to some of the interviews, you'll get an idea of what I mean. Now let's try to keep this simple and clean. Jack did an awful lot of moving around in the industry once he got his feet wet. He began working as an actual newspaper syndicated cartoonist, doing comic strips and political cartoons. Then he ended up moving to the famous Fleischer Studios. That was a place that was doing those old Superman cartoons, and he ended up working as an in-betweener on Popeye. Now, as much as Jack said that he could appreciate a hard day of work, he did not like the production of animation. He felt like it was very cold and sterile, and he moved on. Now, what's interesting, by this time, Superman, Batman, Shazam, they all got the comic book medium in the spotlight. So he ended up finding a job with the legendary Will Eisner Studios. Jack's range and adaptability were a big asset because they had him working on everything from westerns to strange cartoon animals. They had him working on sci-fi, pretty much anything they could get him. In 1939 is when he came up with that little pseudonym Jack Kirby. It's a longer story, but he says it reminded him of James Cagney. Next year, in 1940, he ends up marrying his sweetheart, Roz Goldstein. The two of them stayed together for Jack's entire life. Now, legend has it, at this point in Jack's life, he flew off on Pegasus to a mysterious mountain range in Macedonia. And while he was trying to find the oracle to ask him what to do next, he looks into a golden shield and he sees his father Zeus, who says to him,
"Find and fulfill your destiny."
Inspired by the gods, apparently Jack flies back to Manhattan and he takes a job with the future Marvel Comics, where he meets Joe Simon, and the two of them begin to create history together. Now, during that time that Jack and Joe were working together at Timely Comics, and during the time that they were working on Captain America, the reason they had to stop drawing and illustrating comic books was they enlisted into the armed forces during World War II. Joe Simon went to serve in the Coast Guard, while Jack Kirby enlisted in the Army and fought throughout Europe and was actually a part of Patton's 5th Division.
Out of 1,000 men, only me and 4 other guys came out. See, people think about war like they think about comics or they think about Broadway plays. They don't think that it's serious, that it's reality. And, but it is. You gotta kill that guy.
If you jump ahead to the 60s, I've already explained quite a bit what happened during the section about Joe's life. Jack and Joe are not partnered anymore, and Jack has already worked with many other publishers now throughout the 50s, including DC Comics. Eventually, Joe and the future famous Stan Lee have a conversation, and Jack is now promoted to the art director of the now Marvel Comics. Now, this is where the storm clouds part and legends begin. He and the remarkable Stan Lee begin to generate a portfolio of intellectual property that will change American culture. Now, at this point in Jack's career, here in his early 40s, his larger-than-life drawing style becomes a huge hit with readers, and he is so productive that he is actually writing and drawing sometimes up to 5 comic books a month. Now, many art historians believe that Kirby hit a stride right after Fantastic Four #1. It was so astounding that it has never been matched. You talk about a long-standing record, look at what Kirby created between 1961 to 1965. Jack's approach to creativity, telling stories, and his philosophy about life, they became like a template for all of the other Marvel artists to emulate. The youth of the 60s generation also seemed to find a lot of resonation with his deep spiritual beliefs and a lot of his forward thinking. This was the era where people were exploring areas of consciousness and meaning, and the way that Kirby used his struggle with poverty and discrimination as a Jew in his work, it seemed to really strike a lot of chords with people. For instance, the civil rights battle was reflected in the premise of the X-Men, the comic book about the mutants, swapping blacks for mutants to highlight racism. He also created the very powerful black heroes like Luke Cage and the Falcon. They had prominent position at Marvel, and a lot of that had very much to do with Jack's personal philosophy about equality and rights. Now, if you would like to see the high watermark of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's collaboration as creative people, I strongly recommend you get your hands on a reprint or the original copies of issue 48, 49, and 50 of the Fantastic Four. If you want a glimpse at the pure magic that these guys were creating, those 3 issues will explain everything you need to know about why Marvel Comics began to dominate the industry. Among other things, those 3 issues introduced Galactus, the Watchers, the Silver Surfer, and they basically set the entire industry on fire. Now, at this time, there's also a very complex personal issue growing between Jack Kirby and Marvel Comics. It's really covered in 1,000 different places, and no matter how I try to approach it, I'll never cover it properly. But in a nutshell, Jack was beginning to feel the weight of what he considered mistreatment. Lee was getting far too much credit for the work they were doing, and Jack was not being credited as either the creator or the co-creator of some of the other projects. In addition, Jack never felt like what he was getting paid was keeping with the value he was providing. Eventually, by 1970, Jack Kirby leaves Marvel and he heads to work for DC Comics, the main competitor. Now, in this new era, basically Jack was let loose. At this point, his unrestrained creativity comes up with some of the most amazing characters that have ever been in comics. He creates what is called the Fourth World, which includes the New Gods, Mr. Miracle, and the Forever People. Now, here's an interesting point. Among the New Gods in that universe he created, DC's most powerful villain comes to life. A weird bucket-headed guy named Darkseid. Now let me throw a little ice water at you real quick here. At Marvel Comics, Jack Kirby created Galactus, the ultimate space-devouring, ultimate bad guy, super-powered, indestructible force of nature. And then when he goes to DC Comics years later, he creates somewhat of an analog of Galactus in the villain of Darkseid. Now, as comics go, back at Marvel during this same time, there was another artist named Jim Starlin who was trying to create a villain that was just as equal to Darkseid, so he came up with a villain named Thanos. Now, what I'm implying here is that Jack Kirby is almost single-handedly responsible for all of the multimillionaires that now live in Hollywood. During his employment at Marvel, one of his goals was to create work that was so good that it would outsell the main competitor, DC Comics. Now, in our day and age, Marvel Studios, which is owned by Disney, their major competitor is Warner Brothers, who owns DC Comics. So the entire Marvel universe is being built around Jack Kirby's creations fighting Thanos, who is an analog for the DC Comics main villain that all of their heroes are fighting, named Darkseid. So ostensibly at both ends of the spectrum, Hollywood, in all areas of competition, are basically mining Jack Kirby's ideas for their sales and for their profits of their movies, whether they realize it or not. That's my thought anyway. Now, jumping back into Jack's timeline, but at this point in his life, he's in his 60s, he's not slowing down. He actually does go back to Marvel Comics for a short time. He reinvigorates Captain America, and during that time, he introduces more characters, a group of all-powerful creators that float around the universe called the Celestials, and their weird little offspring called the Eternals. Now, these characters show up in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. This is when they bring the Infinity Stone to the Collector inside of a floating Celestial's head that's out there in the middle of the galaxy, decapitated from a body. And there they're showing how the Celestial uses the stone to tap his stick on the ground and destroy the entire planet. That's when Peter Quill makes a little pea come out of him. So wherever you turn in any of these comic book movies, Jack Kirby's not only got a thumbprint on it, but he's basically got a gigantic hug. So jumping ahead towards the end of his career, he really never quit working regardless of his employer. For example, when he went to Hanna-Barbera Studios, he did character designs for Thundar the Barbarian, and at Disney he did character designs for the Black Hole movie. Now, one of the really interesting little stories that go on with his life at this point, he does some illustrations that are just utterly cosmic and just mind-blowing. He was hired, at least what he thought, to create designs for one of the most cosmic theme parks that ever were going to be built. If you've seen the movie Argo, the one that Ben Affleck did, the artwork that they talk about in that movie and the whole plot behind why the artwork was created, that was all based on Jack Kirby's work. I had an opportunity to meet Jack and his wife Roz at the San Diego Comic-Con back in 1993. As I was walking through the various displays and the artist alley and different things, I walk by and I see Jack Kirby and his wife just standing there in their own little booth. He had some prints to sell. He was standing there with his arms behind his back, and Roz was just there sipping coffee, just casually looking around and observing everything and taking in the scenery. I thought to myself, no, you don't just walk by Jack Kirby. I mean, how is he just standing there? Why isn't he being carried around like a great Roman god being displayed and everyone cheering and shouting and throwing little pickles at him? So I had an opportunity to just walk up to him. I'll forever be grateful for that chance that I had to shake his hand and tell him what his work had meant to me throughout my childhood. He may have only been about 5'4", but that day I felt like I held the hand of a giant. A few months later, the world heard the news. Jack had passed away in February of 1994. This ends part 1 of a 2-part episode about the history of Captain America. I hope you enjoyed the front end, which was loaded with history. Please check out episode 2. We'll cover the actual story and the unique history of Captain America there.
Oh, computers?
Yes.
Well, I think computers are machines that are waiting to do something. We don't know what it is they want to do, see, but we're helping them along. One of these days they won't need our help, and that kind of day is going to be very uncertain for us. It's going to make things uncertain.
Return again for more stories from the Lederman Studio Radio Show.